Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Most of the time, methodology in social science is dominated by ideas, discussions on methods and techniques. They are mostly useful in conducting researches, in getting to know about the formulas of preparing, designing research, framing questions. Methods and techniques do provide discussions on them, provide us with the nuts and bolts, which would be useful in the generation of knowledge, in conducting researches and producing knowledge. Also in academic writing, and the kind of value orientations and all would figure in those discussions. But methodology in social science is also in a great deal about philosophical questions, about various kind of perspectives, about the kind of theoretical conceptual orientations that goes into the making of what we can safely call ways of seeing in social science. This course, which I am going to deliver in 10 lectures, is actually supposed to deal with the intricacies which are related to epistemological questions in social science. It takes a journey into history and philosophy of sciences. It tries to understand the becoming of scientific epistemology. It also tries to understand as to what are the countercurrents of scientific epistemology. Very briefly, it situates some of the scientists, some of the philosophers in the larger discourse, which would be suitable for understanding methodology in social sciences. It also tries to see through the content of the course as to how social scientists, the first generation of social scientists, how did they respond to this predominant scientific epistemology which came into being through various kind of movements, and particularly the Enlightenment movement, which is known in Encyclopedia of Philosophy and in most of the treatises on philosophy. It is known as the springboard of all kind of modern thoughts to emerge. So, while we try to understand how social science responds to those philosophical ideas, and how in response to those philosophical ideas it tries to create its own paradigm of doing things within social science, we also take some specific interest in developments, methodological developments within the discipline of sociology. We try to understand as to how within the discipline of sociology positivism emerges in response to some of those philosophical questions which were very central to the Enlightenment philosophy right from the beginning. Some of those questions which were also expressed in the attitude of noted scientists. For example, someone like Isaac Newton, how his whole mannerism of knowing, his method of knowing, how his presentations of knowledge would become very crucial in scientific epistemology. So, with this kind of orientation, this course would try to touch upon some of the very famous, very well known signposts. However, it also tries to be a little bit of cursory in terms of its approach to those materials. The thickness of materials would probably require one to go deeper. However, in the course content in the next 10 lectures, I would try to touch upon some of those very important things so that we have some familiarity, discursive familiarity with the developments that happens in philosophy and the way it gets into the domain of social science. To begin with, one has to understand as to what is of central importance in philosophy of science. The issue of central importance in philosophy of science comes primarily from history of science, in which we begin to take note of some of those basic epistemes which would become very important in philosophical discussions on science when we are discussing science. More often than not, we tend to think that philosophy of science would be free from just like it's in the nature of science, it would be free from any kind of discursive additions, it would be free from value orientation. But it is not like that. We get a sense from philosophy of science that deliberations on the nature of science could never be free from value orientation, and that makes scientific epistemology very interesting, a field of inquiry, very interesting area to learn about. One recalls a rationalist philosopher of science, Bertrand Russell, trying to distinguish knowledge of truth and knowledge of things. In a typically a rationalist framework, knowledge of things would be central to the field of science. Knowledge of things without any dependence on the interpretations that goes into the discussions on or the knowledge of truth. They would try to create a picture of science. Most of the scientific discussions on science would try to create a picture of science that is free from any kind of judgment, any kind of article of faith. But as a matter of fact, article of faith always seem to be intersecting not only in the practices of scientists, it is also intersecting in the frames of analysis employed by philosophers of science. Bertrand Russell also recognized, despite his reliance on the knowledge of things, despite his advocacy of knowledge of things within scientific epistemology, he recognized that the interface of knowledge of things and knowledge of truth is too strong, and therefore, a lot of discursive interventions within knowledge of things can be detected. The reason why this has to be mentioned is because in the discussion on scientific epistemology, one has to recognize that despite the presentation of one universal modern science coming from scientific epistemology, supported by scientific epistemology, supported by philosophical deliberations on the nature of science, despite that claim of universalism of modern science, one gets a sense that there are varieties of ways of doing sciences. However, all those varieties may not fit the framework of modern scientific epistemology. They may not be fit in the sense that they may not appear adequately rational in structure and design. Despite that, one recognizes that there are varieties of ways of doing sciences, and those varieties are either pushed aside in the history of science or they are incorporated with due terms and conditions. This whole scenario makes the story of science and also the discussion of on scientific epistemology, this whole scenario makes it complicated, and it is up to us to try to understand that complication. Why this scenario, this complicated scenario is important? Because science has been also an enterprise of colonialism or colonial modernity, right. The whole civilization mission, which was in a way also to civilize the benighted heathen, that employed science as a tool to not only project the supremacy of the civilizing superior, it also tried to project the inferiority of the under-civilized, non-civilized inferiors. Scientific epistemology has its own complication because of this recognition that knowledge of truth interferes, and that interference is likely to happen because there are varieties of ways of doing sciences, in spite of the fact that all those varieties may not be fit for one universal scientific epistemology. While scientific epistemology tries to project science, modern science, as a universal entity, one also takes note of various other ways of doing sciences, which makes the domain of scientific epistemology very plural. And with this kind of recognition, one understands that there have been variety of developments, say for example, in the context of colonial South Asia. In the context of colonial South Asia, the civilization mission was premised upon the idea that one has to civilize, the superior civilized folks have to civilize the inferior uncivilized folks of benighted heathen, say for example, right. And thereby science, that modern universal science, also becomes a tool in the hand of those who are in the position of power, who can determine what should be known and what should not be known. And in that light, one began to understand that only Copernican revolution is a real revolution, is a first ever revolution which brought about that golden moment in modern science, in that modern universal science. One does not recognize that non-Copernican revolution, revolutions which were not revolutionary in nature. Say for example, some of those very unknown, unsung farmers who might have developed certain kind of instruments, very benign kind of instruments, which were employed very successfully in the practice of farming. Those kind of developments could be also considered quasi-scientific development, but they would not fit the framework of modern universal science. And that is where one begins to recognize that some of the other kind of developments in the history of colonial South Asia would suggest that there was probably some sense of scientific engagement, scientific practices, and thereby somebody like Savai Jai Singh tried to create his own model of astronomy, or somebody like Tipu Sultan would patronize the development of a particular kind of propellant, which would be later on studied seriously, looked at by some of the practitioners of science from elsewhere, non-South Asian context. So, all those various kind of developments in the colonial South Asia suggest that if not in exactly same rationalist framework, there was certain kind of scientific practices which was around, and putting them together makes the whole idea of scientific epistemology very complicated terrain. That complicated terrain requires very patient kind of engagement with the details of the devil, and the devil here being science, not literally, metaphorically, devil with such richness of details and with such complexity that one kind of universal framework, one kind of universally applicable scientific epistemology probably does not help us sufficiently to understand the nature of modern science, does not help us understand because we do not get to see the contestations which happens here and there, contestations with the nature of modern sciences, the characteristic of modern sciences. Having said that, one has to understand as to how modern science, modern scientific epistemology comes into being. Of course, it comes into being with great deal of enthusiasm about acquiring knowledge of things and not getting lost in the complex journey which is aimed at knowledge of truth. But as it was said earlier with reference to Bertrand Russell, knowledge of truth, article of faith always intersect, and we will be getting to see all those things happening every now and then. Coming back to the idea of Copernican revolution, which was very important moment in the history of sciences. That Copernican revolution was a signpost in the history of science, which ensured that a particular way of thinking about our nature, our natural arrangement, our cosmic world, that particular way of engaging with ourselves, that particular way of engaging with our institutions of faith such as the church, all those things would be upset. Right? This was the first generation of scientists in the history of modern science who tried ensuring that the older value orientation which had great deal of metaphysical inclination, that kind of value orientation would be disturbed, and that disturbance also caused them great deal of discomfort. It also caused them great deal of social and political punishment. It also caused certain kind of silencing of those scientific voices, which were not very suitable for the traditional framework of faith in European world. One begins to see the replacement of one kind of theory with another kind of theory as a very decisive moment in the history of science. One realizes that shift from heliocentric theory to geocentric theory. This was a radical shift, revolutionary in nature, and therefore Copernicus is always hailed as the trailblazer in the history of science, modern science. In the history of modern science, Copernicus brings about this radical phase by dethroning Earth. It is a shift from geocentric theory to heliocentric theory. In geocentric theory, traditionally it was believed that Earth is central in the whole cosmic design, and everything else, all kind of celestial bodies revolve around Earth. In heliocentric theory, which was a radical shift from geocentric theory, it was sun that became suddenly important, and with this kind of changes of the celestial bodies from their position, one began to see a disturbance in the institutions of faith, and in the social practices it was received with all kind of reactions. As it is said, the first serious eruption of science was the publication of Copernican theory in 1543, but the theory did not become influential until it was taken up and improved by Kepler and Galileo in the 17th century. Then began the long fight between science and dogma, in which traditionalists fought a losing battle against new knowledge, and this new knowledge was obviously, as it is understood, scientific knowledge. Bertrand Russell hails it, celebrates this moment in history of natural science, and tries to convince us that if this were not to happen, modern science would not have come to that moment where a philosopher, an important philosopher of the Enlightenment movement such as Immanuel Kant celebrated that moment in Enlightenment philosophy because of science and the presence of scientific epistemology. Immanuel Kant thought that there is a moment for the humanity all over the world to rise from slumber, from the deep slumber which was supported by institutions of faith. However, it had its own repercussions in the sense that ecclesiastical authorities, the church, and also some of the reformist leaders, they were not very comfortable with this kind of change which was provided by the theoretical ruminations of scientific nature given by Copernicus. They were very uncomfortable in the sense that they felt that it was more like a rhetorical, it was more like a very publicity stunt on the part of Copernicus, and authorities also sought for certain kind of punishment for some of these extraordinary, ingenious and so-called wayward scientists who required to be taught a lesson, otherwise they would continue with this kind of theories which would not be very suitable for the traditionally held cosmic design. In addition to Copernicus and following Copernicus, almost a lot of things started happening. Copernicus' elaborate work, which as I informed, which came in 1543, became a ground for many of the scientists to develop certain kind of mathematical precision to talk about the arrangement of celestial body, and also show that Earth is not central, and Earth is also in some kind of rotational relation in spite of the consequences and reactions coming from various kind of authorities. One remembers that Copernicus's thesis was dedicated to the Pope. It was dedicated with this belief that the institutions of faith would not react to it. Instead, it would try to understand what is being offered in the thesis. However, that was not the case. There was Catholic condemnation of this thesis, and following that Galileo tried to work on mathematical calculations in the light of Copernican thesis, and he tried to fulfill the gaps here and there. However, empirical verifications were not sufficient to make this thesis, to make the heliocentric theory get widely disseminated amongst the folks who were educated and enlightened. Instead, it so happened that it remained in the circle of gossiping, where it was ridiculed most of the time. It was the dissemination of this thesis did not happen until Kepler. Kepler was another Protestant astronomer inclined to Pythagoreanism, and he provided the details about the elliptical mobility of the planetary bodies, including Earth. And it was consistent with Kepler and accepting his findings that Galileo developed a theory of dynamics using the concepts of acceleration, change of velocity. He showed the circular movement of a body toward the center of the circle. Moreover, the law of inertia aided in explaining the reason why the rotating earth does not slip away. This was an interesting puzzle in the history of science. Besides, he explored Milky Way and thereof stars, satellites of Jupiter inter alia. What matters most, once again, is the socio-political implications of the scientific advances that Galileo made. Again, returning to Bertrand Russell, he informs us that Galileo, as everyone knows, was condemned by the Inquisition, first privately in 1616 and then publicly in 1633, on which later occasion he recanted and promised never again to maintain that the earth rotates or revolves. The Inquisition was successful in putting an end to science in Italy, which did not revive there for centuries, but it failed to prevent men of science from adopting the heliocentric theory, and did considerable damage to the church by its stupidity. The quote ends. The trail of science to be followed by the philosophers in the succeeding centuries was duly set. The ultimate addition was, of course, of Isaac Newton, upon whom the abundance of praise has been showered from all quarters, as we know. The uncannily high position of Newton at times confuses whether he was a scientist or a miracle man, though it all begins with his much celebrated Principia Mathematica in 1687. If John Locke, a philosopher, very important philosopher in the Enlightenment philosophy, John Locke called him the incomparable Mr. Newton. Edmund Halley deemed Newton closest to God. David Hume praised him as the greatest and rarest genius ever born. And Leibniz went to the extent of suggesting that Newton's mathematical contribution was equal to the extent of suggesting that what Kant had to pay, Newton's mathematical contribution was equal to all achievements in science, Leibniz said. And when Kant had to pay compliment to Condorcet, he called him the Newton of the moral world. No wonder Alexander Pope voiced it as an epitaph. Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, "Let Newton be," and all was light. Belonging to a Puritan family, Newton's orientation in science, mathematics and philosophy emerged from his reading of Aristotle and René Descartes, among others. His cordial association with John Locke and dispute with Leibniz are noteworthy too. He developed calculus in mathematics, law of gravity in physical science, and contributed to optics in addition to contributing in mechanics, astronomy, experimental chemistry, alchemy and theology, and so forth. These are general knowledge on Newton's contribution. His philosophical acumen showed in the Principia Mathematica, and his stature continued to be blown into what has been termed Newtonianism. In Newtonianism, the term Newtonian refers to several different intellectual strands unfolding in the 18th century. In this very brief trajectory emerging from history of science, there is an idea of the new knowledge, the modern science. How it was born, one can guess how it was born from this trajectory. It had started dethroning traditional authorities and decentering the central dogmas. It is in this wake that a philosopher like René Descartes' philosophical meditations earned great deal of respect and importance. Known as the founder of modern philosophy, Descartes had good grounding in mathematics. He is known to have invented the initial version of coordinate geometry, and he was profoundly aware of development in physical astronomy. What is the objective of this discursive development? Philosophically relating science to the ideas of progress. Immanuel Kant aptly summed up the objective in a lecture answering the question. When he was trying to answer the question, what is enlightenment? Immanuel Kant says, and I quote, freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. This freedom is from all authorities that deemed that demanded from us obedience, conformity, docile agency, and overall self-incurred immaturity. Kant goes on enlisting such forces which can be responsible for sustaining the immaturity of humanity. It could be religion, religious institutions, state, a revolution and its leadership, bureaucracy, an army, inter alia. They all can be responsible for keeping us immature. They can all force us to sustain our self-incurred immaturity, against which the whole design of Enlightenment philosophy comes and enables anybody interested in adopting the lessons from the wisdom from the philosophical axioms from the Enlightenment movement. It tries to equip us from in fighting against self-incurred immaturity. Each of the institutions, each of the stakeholders in those institutions would obviously try to put a caveat, would try to stop us from applying reason. It would stop us from being rational. But Enlightenment philosophy, the idea of enlightenment, tries to make us free enough to make our choices, free enough to be rational, free enough to apply our reason. Each is an equally endowed citizen with freedom to think. In the world of humans, each is capable with the freedom to think, and as it was said earlier, freedom to think charts a journey determined by philosophy of science, scientific epistemology, and methodological empiricism, which becomes very important category. Each mind is thus a thing of extraordinary caliber. The Cartesian apprehension of challenges arising from one's own body and external influences, that kind of Cartesian apprehension is tackled in the body of Enlightenment philosophy and the consequent scientific epistemology. In the later part of the lecture, we begin to understand as to how Cartesian philosophy tries to deal with some of these issues about self-incurred immaturity. We will see in the following lecture as we proceed that the whole body of philosophical knowledge would be on one hand addressing all those things which make human tendencies, human nature to err. All those things would be subject to critical discussion, and there would be an attempt to develop certain kind of philosophical tools or philosophical acumen, to develop certain kind of philosophical attitude that can help humankind get rid of all those things of dependence, all those things which are related to our humane nature of depending upon various kind of authorities and sources. Those sources and authorities are considered the first point of Enlightenment criticism, and Enlightenment philosophy and its scientific epistemology tries to prepare humanity to fight against all those sources of ignorance. So, as I discussed earlier, methodology, a discussion on methodology, a discussion on philosophy related to social science will have to include some of those kind of aspects which are usually not discussed in, say for example, lectures on methods and techniques, lectures on how to do research, a discussion on methodology in social science pertaining to epistemological bedrock, currents, undercurrents, countercurrents. That kind of discussion need to be more nuanced, in the sense that it has to bring in some of those features which put together create an idea of way of seeing in social sciences. In particularly, if we take example of sociology, there has been variety of ways of seeing. However, most predominant variety has been positivist way of seeing. Presenting methodology as a way of seeing is an intriguing exercise. It's an intriguing exercise in the sense that it requires one to be aware of intellectual politics that is involved in the way a social scientist would like to see things in reality. The way certain kind of realities would be seen, certain kind of realities would not be seen or would be kept out of the purview of seeing, would be kept out of the methodological apparatus. That whole inclusion and exclusion while observing social reality, dynamics, institutions, human relations, social interactions, while observing all those things, we tend to employ a way of seeing, which can be called a methodological orientation toward an issue under consideration, an issue under discussion. So, in these lectures, what we try to do is to unravel that part of methodology which constitute our way of seeing in social sciences. By unraveling that part, we are actually trying to understand as to what kind of intellectual politics is at work when a social scientist from any kind of disciplinary background tries to see something. When a political scientist tries to understand statecraft, say for example, when a historian tries to make a venture into historical reality, or a sociologist tries to understand a certain kind of issue under consideration, an anthropologist tries to understand the kind of interaction societies will have, etc., etc. No matter in which disciplinary background we try to employ it, but methodological preparation of a researcher, of a seeker of knowledge, assumes that the seeker of knowledge is going to employ a way of seeing which will be informed by theories, which will be informed by epistemological discussions. All kind of discourses would be at the disposal of a social scientist, and they all will create this idea that there is a particular kind of way of seeing at work according to which the seeker of knowledge is trying to know something, and in that process of knowing, at times self-consciously, and on so many occasions we see that not so self-consciously one does exclusion and inclusion of the detail. So, that is in a very simple way I am trying to explain as to how methodology comes to very practical kind of realization in the pursuit of knowledge in social science, how it takes the shape of a way of seeing, and how that way of seeing itself would perform certain kind of intellectual politics. As I would do in these lectures, it would try to spell out certain kind of discursive interjections. It would try to touch upon some of those very important signposts which are responsible in constituting that way of seeing, which gets identified with science, modern science, its scientific way of seeing. Also, we try to see as to how those who are trying to understand, who are trying to know something in social sciences, how do they respond to this scientific way of seeing, and what kind of way of seeing emerges within social science from the epistemological and theoretical engagement by some of these social scientists. In this whole trajectory, we find that one category that emerges in extremely central fashion is the category of experience. Now, there is no seeker of knowledge who would not say that I am trying to understand certain kind of experience. Pursuit of knowledge is by and large about trying to make sense of experiences, experiences of past, experiences of present, and also trying to deliberate upon possible experiences of future vis-a-vis utopia, dreams, vision of future, etc., etc. It's by and large about trying to fathom experiences of various kinds. So, the relation of experience with methodology, with epistemology, and with way of seeing in social science becomes an important kind of relation, very integral to methodological discourses, as we would see throughout these lectures. Experience, as it may appear, is not very innocent category. We begin to recognize throughout these lectures that innocent is not an innocent category. Experience is not an innocent category. Experience is also not an independent category which exists ex nihilo, which exists irrespective of anything else. Experience never exists in vacuum. Experience exists in context. There won't be any meaning of experience if there is no clear-cut context of those experiences. A lot of time our fiction writers, our novelists, our poets would try to deliberate upon, would try to transact certain kind of experiences, and even those experiences transacted to us through the means of poetry, through the means of art, visual art, cinema, from all these kind of cultural expressions, the variety of experiences which are transacted to us, they make sense to us when we referred to, when they are referred to cultural contexts. It is in a cultural context that a particular kind of shared experience becomes available for interpretations. It becomes available for understanding. It becomes available for further discussion and further kind of deliberations. While taking note of epistemology of modern sciences, epistemology which is at the core of social sciences, we would be invariably looking at the varied manner in which the category of experience is spelled out to us. We would begin to recognize that experience, this simple word, has such a practical value for those who are in the pursuit of knowledge. In sociology, we have also noticed, and in other branches of social sciences, we have noticed that experience is also subject to very critical kind of debates. So, one has started asking, say for example, whose experience really matters, right? Who should be speaking on behalf of whose experience? These kind of questions. A question such as whose experiential narrative would be more important, an insider's narrative or an outsider's narrative? These kind of questions are emerging. And the reason why these kind of questions are emerging is also because in the intellectual trajectory of discussion on methodology, of discussion on way of seeing, we have arrived at that juncture where we are now equipped, intellectually equipped, to ask for the detailed nature of experience, to indulge ourselves in critical debates on the category of experience, and also try to fathom as to what kind of politics, intellectual politics, any experiential narrative performs, and looking at the merit or demerit of those of the intellectual politics performed, we try to adjudge the validity of experience. Having said that, what this whole set of lectures would try to perform for the audience would be that it would try to help to begin with us understand as to how modern science can be situated with regard to scientific epistemology, how history of science and philosophy of science inform us about the becoming of modern scientific epistemology, what kind of determinant effect it has in the long run. We begin to see as to how the emergence of empiricism, which is very cardinal feature in modern
social sciences, how this variety of philosophy, the empiricist philosophy, philosophy of empiricism, how this variety emerges in the larger framework of the Enlightenment philosophy. We begin to see that on the whole this scientific epistemology becomes a source of inspiration, a source of information, a source to which most of the first generation social scientists would be responding. We begin to realize that there are some of the forerunners of modern social science, and particularly forerunners of sociology, who would be very consciously joining in debates with the Enlightenment philosophers. However, they would try to exhibit a very different kind of nature, in the sense that they would be by the way of responding to philosophers, they would be actually discussing the categories of social concern. They would be actually discussing the categories of social institution, justice, law, etc., etc., community, solidarity, and so many other things, even something like a possible contract, social contract. All those ideas would start emerging, and we get a sense that these are the forerunners of modern social sciences, who by the way of responding to the Enlightenment philosophers are actually trying to pave the way for sociologists, for political scientists to take it further in more methodologically organized manner. And those forerunners of modern social sciences also become very important. I will be briefly touching upon some of those forerunners. I will be looking at someone like Montesquieu. I would be looking at someone like Jacques Rousseau, and moreover we would be trying to take a look at, very briefly look at the conservative thinkers, romantics, and as to how their contribution into Enlightenment philosophy actually becomes a very different kind of contribution, in the sense that it allows modern social sciences to emerge from that kind of philosophical churning which Enlightenment philosophy tried to create for us, right. And following these forerunners in social sciences, we get to see the first generation of sociologists, social scientists, who would be engaging with the idea of empiricism, some of the fundamentals of empiricism, who would be engaging with some of the fundamentals which have emerged from Enlightenment philosophy, and they would try to create something which would be famously known as positivism. Now, positivism itself is not just a word, it is a very, very immensely important kind of practice which till date dominate pursuit of knowledge in social sciences. Positivism is not just a kind of logical conclusion that comes into being after Enlightenment. Positivism is a grand idea, it's a vision for social science. Positivism, in spite of all kind of criticism it has invited in the long run, and we are familiar with a lot of critique of positivism, in spite of that we realize that positivism comes into being as a very promising kind of paradigm for most of those first generation social scientists, whose idea was not just to understand social world, whose idea was not to just understand human social world, their idea was also to contribute into the transformation of the social world, to contribute into the maintenance of order in society. They were also, with this category of positivism, they were also driven toward addressing the problem of anarchy, which was very prevalent because of the as a consequence of many kind of movements in Europe. The idea of positivism therefore has a double role, a broadly double role to play. On one hand, it enables social scientists to participate in the remaking of social order, normative order, and on the other hand, it is also a premise, it is also a paradigm to do social science in such a manner that one would be knowledgeable enough and knowledgeable in such a manner that one would be able to contribute to society at large. Positivism therefore sets the tone in the very beginning of modern social sciences, it sets the tone to make social sciences practically useful for society, practically useful for polity, and thereby one begins to understand the heaviness that comes with this word positivism. Positivism is not just a word. I would like to reiterate it again and again throughout. In spite of all kind of criticism, it holds immense importance amongst social scientists, and therefore one finds that there is this neo-positivistic kind of tendencies in social sciences, which invariably in spite of the sensitivity to generated by the criticism of positivism, it nearly performs similar kind of job of doing qualitative, quantitative researches and trying to understand society with this kind of normative responsibility that one has to contribute towards society, etc., etc. This is very important. Why? Because positivism informed classical social sciences, classical literature in sociology, particularly in anthropology we get to see, in political science as well as in other kind of social science branches, but in particular I am referring to classical sociology, where we find that positivism becomes the ground for the first generation sociologists to engage with society, to engage with the predecessors which had happened before them, predecessors who were hallowed Enlightenment philosophers, predecessors who were the forerunners of modern social sciences. On one hand, they are engaging with them. They are also trying to very critically respond to the predominant role of logic of empiricism, and they are trying to not just replicate everything that was given to the classical sociologists by Enlightenment philosophers. The idea was not to replicate, and therefore within classical sociology I take up three names famously known as Trinity in sociology. However, that can be a very debatable issue as to why only these three in Trinity and why not someone else. So, I take for example the work of Emile Durkheim, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and in their work I try to see what kind of methodological deliberations are available, and looking at that methodological deliberation I try to show through my lectures as to how they are not just replicating everything that came from Enlightenment philosophy, they are critically engaging with them and they are trying to add their own bits according to their vantage point, according to their intellectual preferences, according to their experiential narrative, and according to their agenda, respective agenda of intellectual politics that they have in their mind. They are trying to contribute to the larger discussion which creates a very rich epistemological trajectory for social sciences. From there we come to that part of discussion where we revisit the category of science. Why? Because there is criticism of modern science which becomes very prevalent in history of science as well as philosophy of science. We take note of the work of the suggestions and arguments made by Karl Popper, and we begin to realize that Karl Popper, along with his opponents, intellectual opponents in various quarters, be it in history of science, say for example Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, or be it in sociology, say for example the Frankfurt School sociologist Adorno, Habermas. With all of them we begin to recognize in later part of our discussion in one of the lectures, we recognize that science itself was not an innocent category. Science itself had its own limitations. We begin to recognize that with science came some other kind of ideology which was scientific ideology of some sort. It is famously known as scientism, science's belief in its own self, and one also qualifies this belief by saying that it's very arrogant kind of belief of science in its own capabilities, that it can do most wonderful things, that it is the ultimate source of knowledge. This kind of scientism was under attack in this at this particular juncture in intellectual history, at this particular juncture in scientific epistemology. In history we get to understand that scientism was under attack. However, there was a necessity to return to science with great deal of larger amount of sensibility, and that is why someone like Karl Popper would try to broaden the framework of science within which some of those kind of materials which were in scientific orthodoxy, which were considered spurious material, which were considered secondary material, some of those materials, some of those sources of information would be also under discussion, under debate, and with that kind of realization we begin to think that science itself requires several rounds of debates, and in that kind of situation we begin to understand that if science can be revisited, so could be positivism. If science can be revisited and one can try to detect any kind of intellectual hegemony inherent in the characteristic of science, likewise one can try to detect inherently hegemonic nature of a paradigm such as positivism. However, this does not mean just criticizing and unmasking and trashing and totally dismissing the significance of either modern science or positivism. The idea is to critically engage with some of these very powerful vantage points which have emerged in scientific epistemology. By engaging critically with them, one tries to find something which in one of the lectures, as it would be called, which brings about some kind of post-positivist turn in social science philosophy. This post-positivist turn was a radical turn, no doubt about that, and there is no linearity about the advent of post-positivism in social sciences. One would not be able to say that it happened precisely after Second World War, because one also understands that there has been some of those tendencies already there with many of the philosophers. As we would notice in one of the lectures which would appear immediately after this one would notice that a philosopher such as Bertrand Russell was very uncomfortable with a skeptic such as David Hume or a romantic philosopher. With them he would be uncomfortable because he would think that some of those variants within Enlightenment philosophy brought about a very maddening kind of subjectivism which was antithetical to the cleanliness, the rationality of scientific epistemology, and that discomfort itself would be very revealing kind of discomfort. So, with that sensibility we turn to post-positivism, and that is where we begin to realize that with everything, all those things with which we were uncomfortable has to be brought in again in the center of discussion. Say for example, if before the turn of post-positivism, if a word such as subjectivity was an entirely negative word, it is with this turn we call post-positivist turn, we begin to notice that subjectivity is not that a negative, not such a negative term. It can be as important a term as its binary opposite, that is objectivity. Coming back to the linearity question, the idea is not to present a linear history here. The idea is to have many of these jump cuts, back and forth movement, and try to see as to how some of these elements were there as shadow present in the otherwise very rationalist variety of scientific epistemology. One is aware of some of those philosophers, as I told you, skeptics and romantics were some of those types, conservatives were some of those types of bodies of philosophy, and likewise one is also aware of some of those developments in the work of art, in the work of fiction, which were deeply romantic, and they offered staunch critique of modern sciences. One is also aware of the promotion of intellectual anarchy in some of the quarters in this historical trajectory. And given all these kind of varieties, one does not find it very easy to draw any kind of linear trajectory and suggest as to what starts where and what ends where. That is not the idea here. Something like phenomenology, a body of philosophy called phenomenology has a posterity, and it is almost more or less overlapping with the linear time frame in which Enlightenment philosophy happens. However, the popularity of phenomenology goes up much later, right, and therefore and phenomenology was some kind of effort to build up a science of subjectivity, as Edmund Husserl tried to do it, and later on in sociology someone like Alfred Schulz try to translate the philosophical work of Edmund Husserl and create a body of phenomenological thoughts which would help in methodological preparation of social scientists. And so these are the virtuous outcome of what we call roughly broadly post-positivist turn in social sciences. Without getting into the details of variety of contributions within phenomenology, we just look at some of the major signposts and try to understand. We also try to understand as to how these developments in the name of post-positivist social science were also responses to a kind of intellectual dispute which emerged in Germany, which was famously known as German dispute on positivism, and that positivist dispute was a reminder that social science has to go through various phases of intellectual disputes. This is despite the fact that most of the time, and particularly this is the nature of social science today, the nature is that we do not tend to get into any kind of dispute. The sight of intellectual duel or a quarrel where two parties or more than two parties stick to their guns, stick to their position and marshal all kind of details and arguments with good body of arguments in hand, they try to fight each other. That thing is, that nature, that tendency is a thing of past probably, and in that kind of situation it is always interesting to revisit that glorious moment when philosophers and sociologists locked their horns and they had no problem in getting into some kind of dispute. One can understand the importance of such dispute. Why? Because these were the disputes which ensured the possibility of progress, intellectual progress in social sciences. It ensured the possibility of progress in epistemologies within social sciences, and thereby philosophical background of social science becomes an exciting area of learning. Then after taking note of the post-positivist turn in social sciences, we get to see that something which appeared as a simple category such as experience in the beginning in scientific epistemology has actually become a vexed category, a loaded category. Experience as a category which does not offer you solution, instead it offers you possibility to get into variety of debates which possibly cannot be resolved easily, right? Experience becomes a bone of contention with post-positivist turn. Experience certainly becomes a bone of contention. One begins to recognize that it's not a simple unit of knowledge. It's a unit of knowledge with so many currents and countercurrents that it becomes very difficult to really arrive at a clear answer as to whose knowledge is really better, or whose truth claim is really superior, whose truth claims should be co-opted by a better kind of truth claim. This kind of questions become very difficult to answer. All kind of developments happen, as I would say about the nature of science in colonial South Asia. Likewise, the nature of experience under discussion in post-colonial South Asia, that begins to unfold in very interesting fashion. Say for example, the category of experience employed in subaltern history, the category of experience employed in feminist epistemology, the category of experience employed in Dalit studies, and so on and so forth. We would begin to understand that the category of experience itself becomes a site of intellectual politics. This is an overview of all the set of lectures that would unfold as part of this course. This overview is to appetize ourselves and enable ourselves to venture further and try to see as to how our pursuit of knowledge is not guided merely by certain kind of technical materials, certain kind of method, technique, formula, research design, hypothesis, research questions, idea of field, or the question of research ethics. That formulaic idea of knowing is given a back seat here. What is given the front seat is that in addition to all these things which are very technical, which are more tangible than what is being presented in this set of lectures, some of these kind of materials which are about how a social scientist comes to decide that this is the way of seeing that I would employ. This is a question about actually intellectual software of social science. It is a question which would not lead you to necessarily to certain kind of method, technique, tools. It would, however, lead you to do certain kind of maybe at times painful stock taking exercise, to do something which would be later on in social sciences celebrated as self-reflexivity, right? If a social scientist is self-reflexive enough, this kind of deliberation would be of immense importance to them. Thank you.